The wind was a blade, honed on the distant, unforgiving peaks and driven into the heart of Gallows Creek. It flayed the raw skin of Alara's wrists where the ropes bit deep, and it tore at the thin linen of her shift, a garment meant for a wedding bed, not a pyre. The wood beneath her bare feet was a lattice of damp splinters and frozen mud, a cruel mockery of an altar. Around her, the faces of the town were a pale, smudged tapestry of grim satisfaction and fearful piety. They were her neighbors, the women who had clucked over her as a babe, the men who had offered sober nods to her father in his better days. Now, their eyes held no recognition, only the reflection of the judgment that had been passed down from Preacher Theron's pulpit. Her sin, he had called it, a refusal, an impurity of spirit that had surely invited the blight that now crept through the autumn wheat fields. The lie was a living thing, coiling in the pit of her stomach, more nauseating than the terror itself. She had refused him, his damp-palmed advances in the shadow of the rectory, and for that, she was a witch. For that, she would burn. Her gaze drifted past the tight circle of righteous faces to the periphery, where the town's shame lingered. There, leaning against the sagging wall of the tannery, was her father. Brant. A bottle, dark and nearly empty, was clutched in his hand like a broken scepter. His shoulders were slumped in a familiar posture of defeat, his face a ruin of broken veins and gray stubble. He would not meet her eyes. He had not spoken a word in her defense at the sham of a trial, had only stared at the floorboards as Theron's accusations, slick with false piety, had condemned her. She had expected nothing, and he had delivered precisely that. A familiar, aching disappointment settled over her, a cold weight that was somehow heavier than the prospect of the flames. This, she thought with a clarity that bordered on madness, was the true emptiness. Not the dying, but the dying utterly alone, a spectacle for the virtuous and an afterthought for the man who gave her life. The smell of pitch and dry kindling rose to meet the frigid air, a foul incense for her sacrifice. The crowd shuffled, a low murmur rippling through them as a boy with a torch approached. Despair was no longer a wave. It was the ocean in which she drowned. Her world had shrunk to the rough texture of the post at her back and the vast, condemning silence of a gray sky. Preacher Theron raised his hands, a showman quieting his audience. His voice, practiced and resonant, boomed across the square, each word a stone cast at her. He spoke of cleansing, of purging the rot from their godly community. He spoke of her vanity, her stubborn heart, a vessel for dark whispers. Alara closed her eyes, trying to summon the face of her mother, a memory warm and smelling of lavender and baked bread. But the image was fleeting, scattered by the wind and the preacher's venom. She felt a phantom warmth on her shins and her breath hitched, a ragged, animal sound of panic. The torch was near. She could hear the crackle of the pitch-soaked rags. Her body tensed, every muscle screaming to flee, but the ropes held her fast. This was the end, a confluence of lies and fear and the damning weakness of men. She opened her eyes for a final look, not at the hateful face of the preacher or the blankness of the crowd, but at the broken figure of her father. For a single, lucid moment, their eyes met across the square. In his, she saw not the usual vacant haze of cheap whiskey, but something else. A flicker, a terrible, agonized spark of memory, of a promise made to a dying wife long ago. It was a look of such profound self-loathing that it eclipsed her own fear. He straightened his back, a slow, unsteady movement, as if lifting a weight he had carried for a decade. The bottle slipped from his fingers, shattering on the cobblestones with a sound that was shockingly loud in the tense quiet. The preacher's sermon faltered. All eyes turned to the disruption. Brant's hand, shaking but resolute, disappeared into the folds of his worn coat. He pulled it out, and in it was the old horse pistol he kept above his hearth, a relic of a grandfather he'd never met. It was rusted, unreliable, a thing of forgotten purpose. He raised it, the long barrel wavering, pointing not at Theron, not at the boy with the torch, but at the unforgiving gray sky above them all. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. He was a drunk, a failure, a ghost in their town, and yet in that moment, he held their absolute, undivided attention. He was an interruption to the holy narrative. Alara stared, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The world seemed to slow, the wind holding its breath. Then he pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a crack of thunder that ripped the sanctimonious silence to shreds. Black powder smoke billowed from the barrel, acrid and sulphurous. Birds scattered from the eaves of the church, screaming into the chaos. The silence that followed was different. It was not piety. It was shock. It was a fracture in the solid wall of their certainty. And in that fracture, a new possibility was born. The crowd surged backward, a panicked wave receding from the source of the blast. Preacher Theron's face was a mask of incandescent fury, his carefully orchestrated ritual shattered by a drunkard's desperate act. "Seize him!" he shrieked, his voice thin and shrill, robbed of its former authority. Two of the town's stoutest men, members of Theron's council, lunged toward Brant, their faces grim. But the spell was broken. The town's single-minded focus on Alara's immolation had splintered into 100 points of confusion and alarm. It was in that moment of glorious, violent chaos that she felt a sharp tug at her back. A knife, keen and swift, sawed through the ropes binding her to the post. The fibers gave way, and she stumbled forward, her numb arms falling uselessly to her sides. A hand, hard and calloused, gripped her elbow, steadying her. She looked up into a face she knew only from a distance. It was Silas, the blacksmith, a man of few words and fewer friends, who lived and worked at the edge of town, his forge a place of perpetual fire and steel, a world away from the church's cold stone. His eyes, the color of cooled iron, were fixed on her, but his attention was on the square. He said nothing. There was no time for words. He simply pulled her, his grip unyielding, away from the pyre, away from the center of the square where her father was now being overwhelmed, a tragic, futile stand that had bought her these precious seconds. She moved, her legs clumsy and weak, her mind a whirlwind. She did not look back. To look back would be to see her father fall, to see the cost of her freedom, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that she could not bear it. Silas guided her not toward the open road, but into the narrow, refuse-strewn alley between the general store and the livery. The stench of wet hay and coal smoke filled her lungs, a scent of life, of work, of anything but death. He moved with a quiet economy, his heavy boots making little sound on the slick stones. He knew the town's hidden pathways, the veins and arteries that ran unseen behind the respectable facades. They emerged behind his smithy, a squat building of fieldstone and soot-blackened timber. The heat from the forge washed over her, a shocking, welcome embrace. He pushed her through the heavy door into the cavernous dark. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic tang of hot iron and the sharp scent of quenching water. It was a sanctuary of heat and shadow. He released her arm, turning to bar the door with a heavy iron beam. The sounds of the town square were muffled now, a distant, angry roar. Alara stood shivering in the center of the dirt floor, surrounded by the tools of his trade, hammers, tongs, anvils, silent, powerful things that gave shape to intractable metal. Silas turned back to her, his face illuminated by the ruddy glow of the banked coals in the forge. He still had not spoken, but in his gaze, there was no pity. There was only a quiet, pragmatic assessment, as if she were a piece of steel to be tempered, not a girl to be saved. For a long time, the only sounds were the hiss and pop of the coals and the ragged cadence of her own breathing. He moved to a corner, retrieving a thick woolen cloak and a waterskin. He held them out to her. His hands were large, stained with soot, the knuckles scarred. Hands that knew only how to build and to mend. She took them, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, warm. It was the first human touch she had felt in days that was not violent or accusatory. "Drink," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together, and used to speech. She drank, the cool water a balm on her raw throat. She wrapped the cloak around her shoulders, its weight a comfort, its course will smelling of wood smoke and metal, the scent of him. He watched her, his expression unreadable. He was an outcast, same as her. The town tolerated him for his skill but kept its distance. He did not attend church. He did not participate in their festivals or their judgments. He simply worked, his hammer a constant, rhythmic heartbeat at the edge of their lives. He broke the silence again. They will look for you. Theron will not let this go, she nodded, unable to form words. The reality of her situation was beginning to settle. She was a fugitive, branded a witch. There was no going back. My father, she whispered, the words tearing at her. Silas's gaze softened, just for a moment. He gave you a chance. Don't waste it. He gestured to a small, concealed door at the back of the forge. It leads to the riverbank below the old mill. Follow the water west. Stay off the roads. There are hunting trails. He pressed a small, heavy pouch into her hand. Coins clinked inside. It's not much. She looked from the coins in her palm to his stoic face. Why? It was the only question that mattered. Why would he, a stranger, risk everything for her? He looked away from her then, toward the fire, the orange light playing over the hard lines of his jaw. I have seen what their righteousness does, he said, his voice quiet but laced with an ancient bitterness. They burn what they don't understand, or what they covet. He turned back, his iron-gray eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, she saw not just a blacksmith, but a man who had his own history with the town's brand of justice. He had made his choice. He would not be a bystander. He would not be a part of their mob. He would be the hammer that breaks the chain. She clutched the coins and pulled the hood of the cloak over her head, concealing her face. There were no more words to be said. A lifetime of gratitude, of questions, of shared understanding passed between them in a single, silent glance. She turned toward the small door, toward the unknown wilderness and a life she would have to forge for herself from nothing. The fire that Theron had built to consume her had failed. In its place was the steady, enduring heat of the forge, and the small, defiant flame of a life that had been given a second chance. As she stepped out into the biting wind that swept along the river, she did not feel like a victim fleeing her fate. She felt like steel, pulled from the flames at the moment of breaking, ready to be hammered into something new, something stronger. She was no longer Alara of Gallows Creek, the condemned bride. She was a survivor, walking west, with the sound of a blacksmith's hammer echoing in her memory, a promise of resilience in a world made of iron and fire.